Good evening, everyone. We are ready to start. Before I introduce our today's speaker, first of all, a reminder that next week we have another talk. It will be by David Karamian, and he's going to speak about his book entitled Armenia, the Lone Stone, A Traveler's Guide to Tradition and Modernity. And it will be in a different location. Those of you who were with us on Monday, so it's the Gross Industrial Technology Building. So we'll send out, and you can find everything on our Armenian Studies website. And it is my greatest pleasure today to introduce our speaker. This is her second talk. And I know some of you were already here last week during the first talk. But for those of you who don't know, Dr. Talin Suciyan, our 21st Kazan visiting professor of Armenian studies at Fresno State University for this spring semester. Dr. Suciyan was born and raised in Constantinople in Istanbul, where she graduated from Istanbul University. And then she moved on to Germany, where she did her Ph.D. in the University of Munich, where for the past 15 years, if I'm not mistaken, she has been teaching and researching. And Dr. Suciyan has worked a lot on Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and in modern day in Turkey. And I'm really happy to introduce her 3 books that she published. The first one, and you can find these books out there on the table, they are for sale. So you're welcome afterwards to have a look at it, and I'm sure that you will be happy to sign the books. So the first book published in 2013 is titled Outcasting Armenians, Tanzimat of the Provinces. Then in 2016 she published the Armenians in Modern Day Turkey, Post-Genocide Society, Politics and History. It's this one. And literally a couple of weeks ago, the new book came out. So she's quite prolific. This is the new book. And it's entitled Armenians in Turkey After the Second World War, an archival reader of USSR consular documents. So this is the translation of those documents, and they contain some fantastic insights into people's reason why they wanted or they didn't want to go back to Armenia, to the Soviet Union, the other way around. So you are welcome to have a look at those books. They are out there for sale. And I'm not going to continue anymore. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear Professor Meticulously, for all the preparations, technical preparations that we have today. And also, David, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you all for being with us today. At the beginning of the 20th century, after the Armenian genocide, there were 2 groups of people among Armenians: those who survived and those who started to gather the remnants. Those who survived were concerned with the very basics of building life, time and again, wherever their perpetually exiled and diminished lives took them. Those who collected, on the other hand, wanted to seal the end of the story with their own hands, collecting every little thing: letters, postcards, travel documents, photographs, vows, cigarette cases, books, or any other documents, or any other document that would serve to prove the existence of Armenians, rescuing and reconstructing a lost world. Today's lecture is at the intersection of these 2. I will start with the collector, Berç Fenerci, an Armenian from Istanbul, who lived the majority of his life there. He attended local Armenian and French schools, and in his youth, he used to collect stamps, Greek stamps. One day, he found a postcard sent by his grandfather, and so started to collect postcards related to Armenians. His interest in the stories behind the postcards increased over the years, and he oftentimes toured Europe to buy postcards from auctions. In Istanbul, too, he used to visit certain antique shops looking for postcards for his collection. He compiled a philological collection over decades, which has a story to tell, namely the history of Armenians with a beginning and an end. Totaling approximately 1,000 postcards from the Caucasus, Iran, Upper Mesopotamia, Palestine, Cilicia, Asia Minor, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and Italy, as well as the Armenian towns and villages of the old country, they were compiled and organized from east to west. Here is one of his panels, and he has 14 such panels. And this is only one part of it. He used an extensive list of secondary literature when bringing together the visual history line of Armenians, and so the order of his visual narrative was structured through his readings of Armenian history and from the earlier periods of Armenian existence in their historic lands. The first panel of his collection starts with the Armenian kings and prominent figures of Armenian history, and continues with monumental buildings of Armenian architecture, monasteries, and churches. As the collection's visual narrative unfolds, we see numerous postcards, maps of villages, gardens, working farmers, peasants, painters, prominent leaders of Armenians, as you see here, for instance, Hayot Hayrik, Khrimian, and his handwriting, he's giving a reference letter basically by using a postcard. And this is one of two postcards from Fenerci's collection. Registers of orphans and many others. Berç Fenerci exhibited his collection across North American cities after moving to Canada in 1995, and perhaps some of you might have visited one of his exhibits some 30 years ago in the US. I came across this collection 2 years ago in Montreal when I met Fenerci's wife, Nadia, and his daughter, Aslin. It was one of those strange moments when Miss Fenerci told me that they had something at home which might be of interest to me. Words fall short of expressing my excitement when I first saw Fenerci's visual and philological masterpiece put together and kept with care and compassion over decades. In speaking to Aslin for this presentation, she told me that his father was a master of postcards. He could talk on a single one of them for hours. Unfortunately, that knowledge is lost. This is, again, one of his collection. Yet, the collection itself is an amazing visual history of Armenians over time and space. At that time, in November 2023, I had very limited time, so I had to browse the 14 panels quite quickly. However, I still managed to find postcards which were related to my own research, especially that of orphans after 1922 in Greece. Berç Fenerci's collection has some very rare postcards, documents, and correspondences of orphans in Greece, more specifically from the island of Corfu and Syra, which are today most commonly referred to as Kerkira and Syros. So this is the way they are preserved. And this is Berç Fenerci and Nadia Fenerci in front of the panels in one of his exhibits. In the previous lecture, I talked about the letters of Surpik Tekyan from Istanbul to Philadelphia between September and December 1922. As we learned from Surpik's letters, after the Greek defeat vis-à-vis Kemalist forces, Greeks and Armenians of Turkey found themselves on the verge of a new exile. By December 1922, Armenians were looking for any possible way to escape the country. Many found themselves setting sail on the deck of a ship without knowing where they were going to end up, like Yerisapet Boyajian. And I quote, "When the catastrophe of Izmir, Smyrna, happened, they assumed that Armenians supported Greeks. After that, whenever they saw an Armenian, they would treat them very bad. Yegsapet Boyajian Kaprielian was born in 1915 in Konya. I conducted an oral history with her in San Francisco when she turned 100 years old in 2016. She was in very good mental and physical shape and remembered her childhood, the exodus, and the details of her life very vividly. She told me her story of exile that took place after the Great Fire of Smyrna, which followed the Greek defeat in 1922. They first had to leave Konya, arrived in Mersin, two cities quite far away from each other, and from there they left for Greece. They lived in various places under very harsh circumstances of Kahtagan. Kahtagan I use for the perpetual exile, Armenian exile, perpetual exile, the concept of being perpetually exiled. And I think this is important to use in Armenian because this is not being refugee. Because if you are a refugee, you have a, you're seeking refuge in another country, and probably that country is your end destination. In the case of Armenians, they constantly went from one place to another. So that is the term perpetually exiled, and in Armenian, it is used in all publications as Kahtagan, and therefore I prefer to keep the concept Kahtagan in Armenian. So under very harsh circumstances of Kahtagan in Corfu, Samos, and Athens. This is from Samos. Yegsapet Boyajian was here with her mother. It was in this atmosphere that the Armenian administration in Istanbul decided to evacuate the Armenian orphanages and send the orphans to Greece. Defeated and poorly organized Greece was in no way ready to receive neither the tens of thousands of Armenian exiles, including the orphans, nor the more than 1 million Greeks from Asia Minor. Theotoros Lapchingian, known as Theotik, in his yearbook Amenun Daretsuitse from 1924, gave a detailed account of this process and criticized the decision to remove all orphans from Turkey. According to Theotik, the decision was made in haste, without any preparation, and the orphans remained without protective institutions as there were no infrastructure to shelter them and meet their daily needs in the countries they were brought to. In Greece, there was an absolute shortage of food, no beds, a lack of shoes, and no means for the orphans to continue their education. A total of 16,000 orphans arrived to Greece under the responsibility of Near East Relief, about 9,000 of whom were Armenians. And Yegsapet clearly was one of them. Yes, this is some 9 years ago. Berç Fenerci's collection brings together a number of postcards sent by the orphans to their siblings. In the collection, there are several postcards under the heading "The Donation of Vahe Çorbajian," who himself was an orphan too. Çorbajian's siblings were from Ordu, from the eastern Black Sea region, and transferred to Greece, but were not in the same orphanage. Here we have, here we are. This is the route, and this is the first postcard that I'm going to talk about. This is sent from Athens in 1924, probably by his older sister, Koharik Çorbajian. And I quote, "My dear brother Vahe Çorbajian, I'm sending you this card to wish you a happy new year and Merry Christmas. This card should serve as an example for you to carry a happy and cheerful smile on your face, along with your love for cleanliness. Accept my kisses, your sister Koharik Çorbajian, Athens, 1924. End of quote. The second one is dated January 1925, sent from Sira Girls' Orphanage to the Boys' Orphanage. During my research visit to Sira Orphanage in 2023, I was told that girls and boys were strictly separated, apparently so much so that siblings could only communicate by sending each other postcards. The second postcard is sent by Hustiane Soromonian, wishing Vahe a happy new year. And I quote, "Please accept this card and my best wishes and congratulations. I wish you many happy years. Your sister, Hustiane Soromonian, January 1925. From Fenerci's collection, we learned that there was also a fourth sibling, Avak Çorbaciyan, who was at the Corfu orphanage in 1924. Probably in 1927, the date is not clearly legible, but probably 27, Vahe Çorbaciyan was honorably discharged from Near East Relief Orphanage, being considered an adult at the age of 15, as was common. The Çorbaciyans were from Ordu, in the eastern region of the Black Sea coast. So how did the orphans from as far as Ordu, east of Samsun, arrive in Greece? Here we have a first-hand account written by Dr. Karnik Stepanyan, a survivor who went from Malatya to Sivas, where he lived between 1919 and 1922. In 1922, after the defeat of Greece and Kemalist takeover, the American orphanages were shut down. Then Armenian and Greek populations of the city started their departure via Tokat, Amasya, and Samsun, where they boarded the ships to Istanbul to reach Greece or France. Dr. Karnik Stepanyan described their journey to Greece as follows, and I quote, "In December 1922, we took the same route too. We were 50 children, leaving our parents behind, who were supposed to follow us. We reached Samsun and got on the ship with 2,000 kahtagans towards Greece. A cholera outbreak started on the ship. Many people died. More than 1,000 corpses were burnt in the fire grate of the ship, as it was prohibited to throw the corpses into the sea. Then we had to go through 40 days of quarantine and famine, and only by the end of January were we able to reach Greece looking like skeletons." End of quote. Greece had no institutional or structural preparation for these orphans. This resulted in long decades of dire living conditions for the refugees, high rates of child mortality, and more children became orphans as many children lost their parents because of diseases or the lack of food and proper shelter. One first-hand account of the terrible conditions for the arrivals in Greece are the letters of Tsolak Dildilyan, who, with his brother, had been one of the most renowned photographers in the Ottoman Empire. Dildilyan was living in Kokinia, near the port of Piraeus, so near Athens, where many of the Armenian refugees were settled in the tents until shanty towns could be built. He complained of living in the open air amid very unsanitary conditions and lacking the money to start a new life or to even feed himself. Tsolak wrote that he felt himself at the dead end. And this is the historic places, touristic places that today you can visit. And in those days, including Acropolis, were full of orphans, children just left in the middle of, on top of the mountain. And in some cases, there were also tents. This is a picture that I took from one of the 100th anniversary of the catastrophe, Asia Minor catastrophe in Greece in 2022. Okay. We learned from the Armenian delegation's report on the orphans and orphanages in Greece that those orphans who were 14 and older were considered adults. Hence, being an orphan was a temporal category which came to an end with adulthood after 14 years of age. From the report, we also learned that many of these orphans coming directly from the provinces. and were uneducated, while were others who had lived in Istanbul during the armistice years between 1918 and 22, and thus were well educated. Orphans were the best registered group of survivors. The Armenian Relief Organization based in Istanbul, led by Mateos Ebligatian, was coordinating the orphan relief and published a lengthy report of more than 500 pages on the first 6 months of work in 1919 across the empire. Hence, by the end of 1922, the Armenian administration had very concrete information on numbers, whereabouts, and personal information of the orphans. The beginning of 1923 marked the complete dispersion of the Armenian orphans around the world. They were to be sent everywhere. Teotik, in his Ammenun Daretsuitse, held Harutun Khachadurian responsible for the entire catastrophe unleashed after December 1922. According to Teotik, Khachadurian was considered, and I quote, the soul of Near East relief, end of quote, as it was he alone who convinced the Armenian administration in Istanbul to evacuate the orphanages in Turkey. Khachadurian visited Greece and filed a report in 1923 on the whereabouts, numbers, and situation of the orphans, according to which Armenian orphans were scattered all around the world, including to Soviet Armenia, Syria, Lebanon, Greece, Jerusalem, Bulgaria, Romania, Switzerland, Italy, and Canada. The total number of orphans registered by the Armenian delegation was almost 45,000. Armenia was the first in the ranking with 22,000 orphans having been sent there. Second was Syria, including Lebanon hosting more than 8,600 orphans. And third was Greece with an official number of 8,500. The total number of Armenian Kartagan who went to Greece is not even clearly articulated. When I first heard that approximately 10% of the Asia Minor Greeks who were exiled from Ottoman Empire starting in 1922 were actually Armenians, I realized another layer of the catastrophe that had struck both populations. It was the late Josep Barazian from Athens who drew my attention to the fact that the remaining survivor Armenians who were living along the western coast of Anatolia and in Cilicia poured into Greece after 1922, totaling about 80 to 100,000 in all. The importance of this number can be better understood if we recall the fact that a similar number of Armenians remained in Istanbul. Having mentioned this, it should also be remembered that while the northern Greece, the areas around Thessaloniki, and in south Crete were under the authority and jurisdiction of the Patriarchate in Istanbul, at that time, due to their historic Armenian communities, there had been no such community or organization in and around Athens where the majority of Armenians eventually landed and had no institutional support for decades to come. The situation on the Greek islands was not any better, where there were hardly any hospitals or infrastructure which was necessary for thousands of exiles. Okay. Here we have some visuals. This is the orphanage in 1922, which was, I'm going to talk about it, which was built by the orphans themselves. And this is summertime in Syria. And this is the orphanage and the orphans. Having said this, the islands that the orphans were transferred to were not chosen at random. Apart from places on the mainland such as Piraeus, Athens, and the old Armenian communities of Thrace, including Thessaloniki, the island of Corfu, and Syra hosted a considerable number of orphans. An Armenian community existed on Corfu prior to 1922, and even before 1915, due to coffee traders from Harput. This is Zarukyan's family and their coffee shop. One of the most prominent families were the Zarukyans, who were in the coffee business. During my research, I met and worked with the family archives of Paul Zarukyan, who generously shared his family history with me. Manuk and Boğaz Zarukyan, from the region of Kemah, near Erzincan, had already opened a coffee shop in Corfu by 1908. They had a coffee plantation back in Kemah and opened their shop in Corfu in order to sell it. Corfu was historically an important island in terms of trade and hosted a considerable number of Catholics due to it being inhabited by Venetians since the 12th century. Therefore, it could be assumed that the Near East Relief was hoping that the local Armenians, as well as other Christian communities, would assist the Armenian orphans and exiles. Corfu was not only a place of the orphans, but also Armenian intellectuals remained on the island, and they taught at the orphanage. And these were Arshak Boyajian, Levon Tütüncüyan, Hovannes Aspet, Nişan Beşiktaşlıyan, Vahan Tekeyan, and Teotik, until the orphanage was closed in 1931, and they were transferred to Kokinia in the mainland Athens. In August 1923, almost 6 months after the arrival of the orphans, Corfu's orphanage was bombarded by the Italian forces, resulting in the death of more than 30 orphans, with at least 3 Armenians among them. There's a special tombstone at the cemetery of Corfu with the names of the victim orphans. Some of the orphans of Corfu were sent to the island of Sira as construction workers to build Near East Relief's orphanage on the island. According to Armenian delegation's 1923 report, Sira was famous for its architects, and therefore Near East Relief was preparing to open a workshop for orphans there. The report also gave details of their working conditions. In exchange for their work, they would not only have a place to stay and something to eat, but would also receive a wage. Mr. Boyajian, previously a teacher at Robert College in Istanbul, was in charge of the orphans. Curiously, the head of Armenian delegation, Khachadurian, mentioned in his report, and I quote, "All unnecessary and characterless working orphans who cease to be orphans will be released," end of quote. That this sentence is found in the middle of a paragraph which stipulates that construction worker orphans would be paid a wage is a clear indication that both the author of this report and the Near East Relief regarded orphans who were in a position to earn their own money as adults and therefore no longer were required to be provided with care and shelter. This is the orphanage from the seaside, and this is one of the pictures I took. And this is a very typical photograph from the orphanages where you have the children, creating this whole picture themselves. And the building behind is their construction. And this is the museum that you have in the entrance. This is now a military zone, by the way. And the military personnel in that, on this base are very well educated and very sensitive about this issue. And they know the history of the place. And this is a museum at the entrance of the military base. And that here, the one with the colorful frame that you see in the middle. There's a pointer here, but I have to find, okay, here, this one. This is something that, the children's toys, which were found during the renovation work. So they are 100 years old toys of orphans. The orphanage building is today within Syria's military zone. Yes, this is what I already said. And In 1930, the Near East Relief's orphanage on Syria was closed. In that same year, the number of orphans from the orphanage registered to the local high school were 71. Hence, even if we consider some of the orphans were too old or too young to attend high school, the number is still strikingly low, given the fact that orphanage housed thousands of children. Tanya Hitela, a Greek researcher, mentioned that after the closure of the orphanage, children were adopted by the local families. However, it is difficult to imagine that thousands of children would have been adopted. Indeed, Near East Relief states that by 1930, a total of 7,000 orphans had studied on Sira. It is also remarkable that Near East Relief doesn't state where the children went after 1930. Teotik had a point in criticizing the decision makers within the Armenian administration and Near East Relief for sending the orphans to Greece, especially given the fact that Greece was not prepared to receive tens of thousands of orphan children. Starting from February 1924, adult orphans were sent to Kavala in northern Greece as porters. Many of them were given to Albanian and Greek families. Some were married to Greek women and were assimilated to have a better life. Their families lost the traces of their relatives as their names changed and they couldn't be traced after they were honorably discharged from the orphanage. The priority of the Armenian and non-Armenian organizations handling the orphan crisis was to eliminate it by not having any more orphans at all, and this was the reason why increasingly less regular data kept on them. Yet Armenian survivors never stopped looking for their family members. A special file entitled Gpndrvi, looked for, in the archives of the Armenian Prelacy of Athens, demonstrates that Armenians continued to look for their relatives, especially the orphaned children. For instance, one of the applications within it was made by an Armenian from the US who was looking for their relative by the name of Baydzar, who had been sent to Greece as an orphan in 1923. The application was made in July 1978, at which time the child would have been about 75 years of age. Another such case was that of two male orphans from Yozgat who were brought from Istanbul and put in the orphanage of Corinthos. A request from relatives looking for them was received in April 1978. Like tens of thousands of Armenian Kahtagans, the fates of both Armenian and non-Armenian orphans remained rather vague and blurred. While Armenian institutions seem to have registers of orphans, like that of Armenian delegation, the traces of orphans disappeared as they grew older. Interestingly, this is in line with the politics of orphanages, which did not consider children after 14 to be orphans. Like the Armenian Kahtagans and exiles of Asia Minor in general, orphans were also dislocated, dispersed to all parts of Greece, from Crete in the south to Drama and Xanthi in the north, sending them from one place to another, failing to properly register their whereabouts, were important policies towards making them invisible in the long run. These orphans were largely condemned to a life as a cheap, or at times even free laborers and agricultural workers spread out across the country, as well as foster children who would be quickly married to locals in order to better assimilate them. These are some photographs from the orphanage. And this is the building. This is a huge building, as you see, built by the orphans themselves. And this is how it looks like today. And this is us working. Okay. When I started writing this presentation, I wasn't thinking about my own family. My grandmother, Iskuhi Bozoyan, born in Garin, Erzurum in 1915, came with her mother Satenik to Istanbul under unknown conditions. This is Satenik Bozoyan. Yeah, she lost, my grandmother, Iskuhi, lost her twin sister, her father, and the majority of her relatives. Satenik and Iskuhi were two of the tens of thousands of survivors who were able to reach Istanbul. Most of their relatives had been killed, while those who have survived the death marches ended up in Mosul in Iraq, where they would be converted to Islam or Islamicized. Like so many other Armenian female survivors and orphans, Iskuhi would be married to another survivor in Istanbul, later giving birth to my mother. My grandfather felt the need to rename Iskuhi as Silva, probably because Iskuhi sounded too Armenian for Istanbulitan taste, meaning that we knew her as Silva. It took me decades to understand that her name had been ripped off, just as she had been ripped out of her birthplace and the big family she had. Growing up in Istanbul, orphans and orphanages were very present in our daily lives. Armenians still have a couple of orphanages in service of the community. I, too, have been quite unintentionally collecting data and material about the orphans and orphanages over the last 12 years of my research. Seeing the orphans' inscriptions on the walls of Araradian orphanage, well, before going there, this is one of the pictures in 1960s and 70s with my aunt, grandma, and relatives from Mosul. They visited them in Istanbul, apparently. Very interestingly, you see an advertisement in Turkish and in German in Istanbul. Okay. And these pictures are from Jerusalem now. So, seeing the orphans' inscriptions on the walls of Araradian orphanage in Jerusalem was the moment when I realized the omnipresence of orphans in our communities and simultaneously the constant absence of their stories from our lives. Just like the unknown story of my grandmother, Iskuhi. So this is the building which was used as an orphanage, but of course it is it is built for the pilgrims. But after 1918, it was used by the Kazan and the orphaned children, and these were the inscriptions that I'm talking about. That are inscriptions of children who left their signatures. There is one. Yeah, here it's Vartan Hovagimian from the province of Van, village of Shushants, in January 1922, Aradian orphanage. I mean, these are children probably not even older than 10, as you see them. Yeah. The collector Berch Fenerci must have understood the catastrophic situation that the orphans were going through, as he devoted a considerable place in his panels to the issue of dispersed Armenian orphans around the world. Despite the systematic gathered data on them by the relief organizations, they have become extremely difficult to trace after the relief organizations shut down by the end of 1920s. In this way, one of the most vulnerable groups of survivors, orphan children, despite how thoroughly they had been registered, were still completely relegated to oblivion, taking their story of survival with them. The unaddressed orphanhood of the people without childhood, in the words of Antranik Zarukyan, continues to live within our families, deep within our souls, waiting to be recognized, addressed, and honored. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Talin. This was fascinating, and it was so interesting when you were telling us about the boat trip from Samsun to Greece. So my grandmother's family split like that. So the Greek grandmother's family. So half of them, part of the family, was pushed towards Armenia. So they went to Armenia, and the other part went to Greece, to Thrace region. So that was basically happening both for Greeks and Armenians, irrespective. Yeah. And if I may ask one question, and then we'll open it for people present here. I'm sure there will be many questions. When you were saying orphan, do you mean that they lost both parents, or just because they were unaccompanied, they were all registered as orphans?
Well, what we understand from the registers, most of the time either one part of the parent is missing. But in the case of Karnik Stepanyan, he had his parents, but they were separated from the parents. So you don't know whether you're gonna, unite with them again or not. And many of them had one parent missing most of the time. But of course, it wasn't an exception that both sides were missing. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, if you have any questions, please.
I'm picturing the 10-year-old orphans building that big building. The orphans actually built the building?
They are the construction workers. I mean, this was clearly stated that they're going to earn a wage, and therefore they're not anymore orphans, as they are adults, to work and earn a wage. So yeah.
So we're talking about them being, as of 14, not considered orphans.
Yeah.
So to speak. I'm assuming that's not the forms of modern society. When and if the adulthood changed its definition since then?
Of course it changed. Now for us it's 18 or 21, etc. But and of course we know that marriages were happening at the age of 14. But it was happening for a person who for a child or for a teenager who had a family. In this case, we are talking about children who do not have that system, that network of family, larger family mechanisms of support. And when you have 3, 4 siblings, they were separated. Well, it's for this case, it's not relevant because they in 10 years of time they were considered adults, and that was it basically. I mean, it's our norm today. It's our norm to understand somebody at the age of 21 as adult or 18. But okay, back in the beginning of 20th century, it wasn't like that. But it doesn't mean that you were ready to cope with all the difficulties of being a survivor at the age of 14.
From medieval period, we have a source that girls were considered to be adult at the age of 12, and they could marry, and boys at the age of 15. So we have it from the medieval period, century.
There was a question at the back. Okay.
Are you related to the Suciyan family? Years ago, they're from orphanage too. They're in Tunisia, and they were descended to the French orphanage, 20s or something.
I don't know about this. Yes.
So I'm thinking, next generation must be living here, and they know any of these stories?
Of course. Yes, of course. I mean, there were a number of exhibits, 2022, 2023, on the centennial of the catastrophe, and Armenians had their own exhibits as well. So they're very much aware of that period that was a particularly difficult, and it lasted long. They didn't have for decades no papers, no passports, etc. And that was one of the reasons why in 1946, when the repatriation campaign, so-called repatriation campaign, was launched by the Stalinian government in Soviet Armenia, many of the Armenians from Greece went there in order to escape the misery, basically, in those years around Athens. Well, was it a good choice? I'm not sure. I don't know. But that was the motivation, at least.
Later in their life, did any of them try to foster their families? Like here in the U.S., we have 23andMe, or so to be able to like a person identify parentage because we have no clue where they were.
Yeah, this was what I was trying to say, that the families were constantly looking for the children, the orphan children, because if they don't have even mother and father, they have some family members perhaps, and they were continuously asking the prelacies, asking for inquiry about whereabouts of these children, and most of the time there was no answer, or they were unable to find, locate, or the child who was not anymore a child was dead. That was also an option. And in some cases, when children found children, adults, or of elderly people at that time, when they found each other, they didn't have a common language to talk to each other.
Please.
You mentioned that Greece totally prepared all these orphans, and obviously the building wasn't even made on that one until the orphans would come and build it themselves. So did many of these orphans just starve?
Well, the child mortality was very high, and diseases were very common, and plague were very, very easily turned into a plague. And but they had something to eat. Those who were, lucky enough, and they were in the orphanages, they were fed. But the problem is not that. What do you do with the children when they are 14? What was happening to them after 14? This is the black spot in history, that we don't know what was happening with them.
Maybe one more question.
Tell us what your third lecture will be on. She's going to be speaking on Friday, March 28th. That'll be in one more month, and it'll be in the same room. So tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, that is going to be on letters sent from Arapgir to Philadelphia before the genocide, 1913. We have been reading these letters. There are 70 plus letters with a group of, with first of all, the owners of the letters and 3 other friends. And over a year, I guess, by now, every week we are meeting, we are writing down, we are reading, and we are trying to understand what all, trying to decipher what all the letters are trying to tell us. So that is a new topic to me as well. And well, this was also a old and a new topic. I have been collecting material, but I wasn't realizing that it was that much until I prepared this one. So I don't really know how the end product will be, but I hope it's going to be okay. Arapgir to Philadelphia. I mean, Arapgir is near Malatya. Are there any questions from Zoom? Because we're not seeing the Zoom at all. And there are 2 other questions here. Yeah. Yeah. There are three more questions, I guess.
Please.
This orphanage, the kids are, they have enough foster parents adopted?
I don't know. I don't know. Yes, please.
Okay, so probably missed it. Who were charged running?
Near East Relief and the Armenian.
Were they Armenian?
Yes, yes. Well, the decision to evacuate the orphanages in Istanbul was taken by the Armenians.
But the Near Eastern Relief was
Yeah.
American.
Was
Right.
okay.
That's why the English language, thank
Yes,
you.
yes. But Armenians were in charge of the
Yes.
orphanage.
Yes.
Okay, so okay.
That's what I'm saying. That's what they are saying. Yes. There's no one. Well, no, there's always a choice. There's always a choice. But I want to refer to Mark Nishanyan here, that the catastrophe, his sentence was, arrête de mezi abakayen bidika. The catastrophe will reach us, will come to us from the future. So probably all those people who were taking those decisions were not aware of what they were deciding to at that time. So they couldn't foresee the type of catastrophe that was awaiting them in Greece. And that is the reason why they also sent people after the children to check them. Because Greece was partly under the jurisdiction of the Patriarchate of Istanbul, especially Thessaloniki, Crete, and those older, historically Ottoman, well, they were also Ottoman, but anyway, so they were historically under the jurisdiction of the Patriarchate. So they sent people to check on the orphans at least once. I don't know about, later on checks whether they were or not. I didn't see them. But after a while, there was no possibility to do anything because it was in another country. I mean, they were in another country. In other countries, plural. All around Mediterranean, in France, in Jerusalem, in Egypt, in many other places. About the reasoning of the decision you're asking, right? The Armenians were Christian. Yes, but you're asking the reason whether Greece, the reason why they were sent to Greece, there was a. Well, I mean, well, of course, in 1922, Istanbul for Armenians was not the best place to stay. I mean, it's clear. But on the other hand, you had a local community, you had institutions like churches, schools, hospitals. I mean, that was an option. I mean, well, it's a post-genocide context. Of course, they were not feeling themselves safe and secure in Istanbul. I can understand that. But it was still, there was still a better infrastructure.
There is a comment in the chat from Susan Ahmadi. It is amazing to contemplate how many of these teenage orphans lost their Armenianness by assimilation after surviving the genocide. In other words, they are another lost diaspora.
They are.
Well, I think we can continue the conversation outside with a cup of coffee, decaf or normal one. So let's thank our speaker.
Thank you. Pictures.
From Marzipan.
Okay. Okay. Anon kalksın.
So,
Okay.